Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, featuring fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Jill Reckless, CEO of RxCelerate.
All right, welcome everyone. We're thrilled that you're back with us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. Although I think, given our guest timeline today, she may be having afternoon tea while we're still having our coffee. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I am the CEO at NewYorkBIO. Like I said, we're thrilled you're joining us. We are also thrilled to have a new sponsor for the next 4 weeks of our virtual breakfast series, and that is the New York Stock Exchange. As many of you know, we work closely with the New York Stock Exchange on a series of emerging biotech company events each year. And our next one is coming up June 23rd, where we will focus on emerging biotech companies from Europe. So look forward to more information on that in the coming weeks. And as always, if you have questions throughout our discussion with Jill, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and Derek and I will moderate that and flip them over to her throughout the course of our conversation. Thanks for joining us. I will hand it over to Derek to more fully introduce Jill.
Okay, Jill, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to have you here because your background in RxCelerate hits on so many things that we love to talk about. You have a fantastic background in academia. You do early stage drug discovery. We have an entrepreneurial company founding story in here, so we're excited to get into it. As we kick off, why don't you give us a little bit about where you came from and how you got where you are today?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to tell you a little bit about the journey and the story that I've had in creating RxCelerate and the journey I've had in biotech. As you've said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of RxCelerate, which is some 8 years old. But prior to that, I was an academic and a research fellow in the Department of Medicine at the University of Cambridge for some 16 years. So I've got the sort of biotech and the academic background that's led to where I am today. And I just something else which I suppose I should put in here. I actually did chartered accountancy for a year. So that's actually given me a little bit more on that business piece, which is really important for creating RxCelerate.
Okay, so why don't we wind the clock back to academia in Cambridge, right? So can we talk a little bit about some of kind of your earlier experiences in the labs? You had some experience in terms of translational development and drug discovery, and how did all of this shape, I suppose, what eventually became RxCelerate? What kind of challenges did you see in the science that you were working on, and did you basically look at a list of things that had to be overcome in order to try and get the science to patients?
Yeah. So I came to Cambridge having done my PhD at Imperial College in London in 1995. So some time ago did I come to Cambridge with the view that I was going to spend 3 years doing a postdoc and then go to the US and do a postdoc there. And having come to Department of Biochemistry and to work with Jim Metcalf, that's where I met David Granger, which may be a name that everybody's familiar with that's on this. And it became very clear to me very quickly that David was ahead of the curve. Not only is he an amazing scientist, but his vision and foresight on how to do drug discovery, that translation of academic to the patient and new therapies, was a really important part of his vision. And he and I very quickly joined together to do academic science with that translational piece. And as you alluded to there, during that 16 years, we were prolific in thinking of ideas, thinking outside the box, trying to generate finance to bring in to do those translational pieces. And the coming of all of that is what led to RxCelerate. So if I track back to, I suppose, one of our sort of early pieces was a company that we founded in 2006 called Functional Therapeutics. And that was actually acquired by Boehringer in 2012. But that journey highlighted a need for something which is what RxCelerate is based on. And ultimately, being involved in that academic piece, we were doing a lot of science that was actually very different to what was classically done at Cambridge. David and I found it quite challenging. We were trying to put a square peg in a round hole because we weren't typical academics. It was still not apparent that that translational piece, that biotech piece from scientists was a natural progression within academia. It was always about publications, which doesn't always sit when you're trying to do that translational piece. So that's how it all came about. And of course, we managed to get funding. David is incredibly talented at getting funding from private investors. And he gave us the tools to be able to, move our vision and our ideas forward at quite some pace, even though we were a relatively small group. So from that, we often got funding from VCs, and in particular Index Ventures. That's how we got, why David effectively, followed that journey with Index Ventures that became Medici later when it spun out. And it became more and more apparent that as we as academics worked, we wanted to be able to do things a little bit different than what had been done before on that translational piece. So yeah, it's been quite an exciting journey and quite a fast journey in many ways here in Cambridge.
So at the time, what was the venture environment like at the time? Because I think you probably had an atypical experience from the standard, biomedical researcher in the UK, right? I don't. Could you give us a sense of just broadly what the environment was like for venture capital as an academic? It's nice to have the in, as it were, with Index Ventures and have David be able to sell the story. But broadly, if you're an academic group and you don't have someone like David, what's it like to try and get attention from the venture community?
It's difficult, really difficult. I mean, typical academics get their funding through granting bodies, and that and obviously that's a competitive environment which has opened up, where everybody, within the UK and wider, it's a larger scope competing for those funds. So it's not only now on the quality of the science, because there's too much quality of science and ideas and probably not enough funding on that. In terms of VCs, if I go historically back, that they were few and far between, and you need to have somebody that's got that vision and foresight to be able to do that. I mean, universities now do have translational groups to support that piece, but of course it's only as good as the people that are working in that unit that can pick up what those ideas are, what's important, what's attractive to VCs, and what do you pull together, that will attract that funding. It's quite a different to be able to do academic research as opposed to being a drug developer, and the two things are very different beasts. So you do need people that have got that vision and that experience, and to a certain extent that's where RxCelerate feels that they really can support that, somebody with an idea, somebody in academia that has worked on something for 10, 15 years but doesn't know quite how to translate it, knows there's something there that could be interesting and important, but it's a big jump. I've spoken to academics that are incredibly talented, that have generated hundreds of publications, but they don't know how to do that translational piece. It's a black box to them.
And what about we spend a lot of time obviously talking with entrepreneurs here that have founded companies and out of academia, and we talk about the intellectual property and how the universities handle that. Is that something that is standard in the UK as to how the universities will allow their IP to be spun out, or do you have to do it every time? Is it a different process each time you want to spin something out?
It is, yeah, it's very much the latter. But as you can imagine, universities will go through with a fine-tooth comb every translational piece to generate and make sure that they're, really making sure that they've got that IP on that piece. But it's very much on a case-by-case basis that is done. It's not a brushstroke. Yeah.
So why don't we go into how RxCelerate came to be, right? Because I'm at, you had the experience with functional therapeutics. It's acquired by BI, and were you in and you were still at Cambridge at the time, right? So were you in a scenario where you genuinely had a what's next type of moment, or were you in a scenario where you said, we've looked at all these problems that we've tried to solve, why don't we see if there's a market for us to help solve them for other people?
A little bit of both, really. So during that time of doing functional therapeutics, and particularly when you're in academia and you have VC funding, there was a lot of work that we were outsourcing. And for the most part, you're sending it to contract research organizations, and there was some standard assays and so forth that you send the details of what you want, you send the samples, a month later you get the data back. But there was some key pieces in the biology that we were doing that were much more complex, and they needed iterative steps to develop models or develop assays that weren't standard. And we were teasing apart new mechanisms for an inflammation. And so it wasn't any of these off-the-shelf or standard approaches that was required. And it was that piece, as you're trying to do it as an outsource, that it was really challenging to do, because you were dealing with teams that were large. You weren't talking to the scientists per se themselves. Everything was filtered through, and communication was always, afterwards. It wasn't, in real time. And that's very difficult for trying to understand and move forward drug development, particularly when you've got a pot of money and it's not ever ending that you can do. And on the back of that, it was something at the back of our mind, David and I, that this could be really useful, that there's a piece available that that we could be not a CRO but an outsourced drug development platform, that we could help on that drug discovery and drug translation piece, but more importantly really interface with the sort of academics, people with these ideas, as if we were part of the same team, so that we could deliver data in real time. And hence, when the asset and Boehringer acquired functional therapeutics, it was a bit of a crossroads. Having done 6 years where I was part academic, part biotech, it's, do you go into academia? And obviously I could have stayed in academia and progressed there, or do I actually go to biotech? But going both, I had to make a decision, and I took the latter. And I suppose, to just contextualize David's role, because as I say, we'd worked on this, was that David obviously had been working with VC and seen that piece, and hence that's why he actually went to work with Index at that point, as I came more into biotech.
Okay. Yeah. So as an analogy, rather than having just the quote unquote menu for a CRO, it's almost like you would step into the kitchen and help cook, right? What is it? What is it that you're really trying to do here, and how can we help you do it?
Yeah. So essentially, one of the key things that we do is we help design the integrated programs, and this has taken something from an idea all the way to proof of concept phase 2. Even if you've only got a small amount of funding for that proof of concept, you need to know the runway of where you're going all the way, along that pathway, even if it's just an overview. So we help design, we ask those challenging questions. I'm forever saying to academics, you've worked in academia for 10, 15, 20 years on your project. I can only scratch at the surface, but I can ask questions, and the wider team can ask questions about extracting that really important information and how that then becomes that translational, plan. You need to have those killer experiments, but you also need to have all the strands that are really important for that translational piece. Now, it may be for a small molecule, can you scale it up? Making it at milligrams and gram quantities is a very different beast to kilos and beyond. It could be that, is the animal model, fit for purpose? Can we use genetic data or human biobank data? It's trying to tease apart what you would do in those proof of concepts, which will allow those larger funding bodies and that translational piece. And at RxCelerate, we have labs and we have different teams that will, deliver on some of that work. RxCelerate has got a foundation of biology of the different strands, but over time, either through acquisition or actually building up from first principles, we've got chemistry, we've got program and operational management, we have got in silico design, which spans chemistry and biology. And more recently, we've developed our own RxBiologics antibody platform.
We were going to get there.
Yeah, I know. I believe that.
So that's an amazing progression. So if we think about this, when you first started, the leap of basically building a team and getting the labs set up, what was that like in terms of working with Cambridge or where you were going to put the labs? Like how did you figure out where you were going to go? How did you think about the early stages of recruiting a team and putting a team together? Because now you basically have an organization that you need kind of a team of people that are going to be a core team and service things, right? You are for yourself, you're the anti outsource, right? Yeah. So how did you tackle that?
Yes, so obviously being at Cambridge for such a long time, and also there was already GSK was close by, and there was emerging biotech. We had things like Abcam, which is obviously, but some of the tools around that industry was starting to be apparent, sometime ahead of that. Cambridge, as you know, like Oxford and London, generated, institutes and lots of inward investment. And of course, it attracted over time, top scientists from worldwide to build and develop those labs. And of course, what tends to happen then is you build an ecosystem of granting money coming in, ideas and that translational piece, and more scientists come. And so there's effectively become, if I go back to, the 90s and the early 2000s, it was becoming that there was effectively a triangle, Oxford, Cambridge, London, which they, they termed it the golden triangle. I mean, today, it's actually a much wider piece across the whole of the UK. I mean, it's important to put some perspective on where, the journey that the UK's had in terms of biotech. I mean, if we think about the proportion of the UK biotech for the whole of Europe, it's close to 60% of that investment. I mean, anticipating this year that inward investment for biotech in the UK will be in excess of £3 billion. We're generating, over £1 billion, so this is early biotech, investing £1 billion per quarter now, close to, and the government has tried to incentivize and generate that innovation piece. So not only have we got things like, even only this year, the Chancellor has announced a new future fund, which is like some 375 million. They have R&D tax credits where you can, have essentially a third back if you use UK companies for your outsourcing and R&D. They have Innovate UK, which is large granting bodies, which will give companies 70% of the funding that they need for a program, and they have to only find the 30%. there's a lot of incentives to be able to develop those early translational innovation. And I think that's what we're seeing across all of the UK now. I mean, Pfizer left in Sandwich in Kent, and AstraZeneca moved from Alderley Park down to Cambridge. And obviously, even those areas now, have got lots of biotech companies. So we've got these clusters all over the UK now that are emerging, and obviously in Scotland and Wales and so forth. So, but Cambridge is still a very large one, as is Oxford and obviously around London. They do say that Cambridge has the largest density of scientists in Europe. I don't know if that claim still holds today, but it's probably close.
Jill, do you we have a lot of the same sort of government incentives, right, around the things that they can impact, right, like the taxes, the tax abatements, employee credits, things like that. What about private investment in the age of Brexit? Are you going to see are you hearing about any impacts of funds that will avoid the UK just given until everything is sort of split and settled?
It's an interesting thing because obviously, as you say, with Brexit, I think academia, we're not open up to all of the larger granting bodies where, the EU and those wider funds. But in biotech and VC, it's still very, very healthy to date. Okay. I mean, it's early days. It only was obviously at the beginning of the year. Yeah. But the early signs are that it's had little impact so far, I think, in the biotech. But I think it's academia that may, and of course, it's part of the ecosystem. So at some point, it may well translate unless there's some kind of inward investment, either from government or, thinking outside the box of what you might do.
Yeah.
Yep. So there's a couple of other questions here. I do want to get one from the audience. And, this is a good one that goes back to private investment. He says, what, if anything, can be done when VCs lack interest in the quote unquote right things? Right, and they're kind of following each other into the latest trends, right? So if you have great science that just doesn't happen to be in the mainstream, how does the investment community tend to look at those things?
That's always a really difficult one because, as we all know, that there are pharma and investors often have got things that they're interested in, whether it's a therapeutic agent or a particular type of class of drugs and so forth, and that translational piece is a key piece. I suppose what I would say is having a good plan and a real a robust input on that of what that plan will look like, and trying to give that confidence on that translational piece, but also trying to break it down into smaller pieces. I think that if it isn't something that there isn't a hook, sometimes segmenting it and giving them, well, if we achieve this with this amount of money, which to a certain extent can be relatively small, it gives them the hook to be able to think, oh, okay, we might do that and then move on to that next piece. So I would certainly be recommending that you split it further to try to, leverage their interest more into, cost versus what that benefit might be. Because obviously, if things go well, it's, even though it might not be of interest to them to start with, you might gain that over time.
Do you find that does the investment community come to you at all in terms of thinking about what kind of things that you're seeing, what kind of things that companies are working on? I know you must have kind of client confidentiality, but are there investment groups that basically come to you almost as a source of either information or strategic thinking in terms of what you think of where certain science is going to go?
It's an interesting thing. So this is something where I think, again, it's not happened is the simple answer. So the answer is no. Mm-hmm. But again, I think it's something where it's that piece of being able to think about drug developers and what, looking at those ideas and plans. I suspect as VCs, that they are bombarded with, tens of thousands of people wanting to get money each year from them, of which they've got to sift through to a manageable number that they assess effectively. And presumably they will assess some at a top level scenario, and then they will sift again and have a smaller number. And so they might end up with 100 ideas. Now, how do you select that 100 ideas to select 10 from that 100? And it's that piece where obviously they go to key opinion leaders, they talk about all of these things, but it's whether they actually talk with drug developers. And it's something that I think would be an interesting concept to explore.
We actually had a question that just came in that ties in talking about fundraising. And the question is, you mentioned that David was particularly effective at fundraising. Do you think it is more difficult for women to fundraise? And if so, how do we fix that?
That's an interesting thing. Well, potentially. I mean, I think women's place in biotech has become more and more emerging. And we can all say now that, we are very much at the party and, are very prolific there. But we've still got some time lag, I think a little bit to have that impact. But there's certainly opportunities out there. I think that people, it's about having a good idea and a good plan. I think if you have a good idea and a sensible plan, there will be some mechanism that you will be able to try and get funding, I think.
Do you think the universities can do a better job of helping prepare their students who are interested in entrepreneurial sort of futures to help learn some of those more, we'll call them soft skills?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, being an academic and being an entrepreneur are very different. And you're not trained to be an entrepreneur and to think that translation. I mean, one of the ideas that I've often thought is that, departments, particularly on those translational pieces, they could have things like scientific advisory boards. They could try to bring that biotech that's trying to mentor, and for them to think about that wider translational piece. They're missing a piece between academia and biotech, and these are the kinds of translational pieces that might help that thinking, and the next generation. Yeah,
we're starting to see some of our universities have sort of entrepreneurship programs as sort of adjacent to some of the other work, and it seems to be helpful.
I mean, here in Cambridge we have the Judge Management School, and that has a lot of entrepreneur type programs where it's facilitating the different departments and so forth, but it's not wide across the country. I think it's something that, again, it's emerging.
So I think this is a good time to think about, you had spun out or formed a new company called RxBiologics, right? So you have a next generation antibody platform. And, thinking about this, where did that idea come, and why did that idea come to fruition where you said, okay, we kind of need to do this ourselves, right? It's as discovery platforms go, there are a whole host of challenges with them. So kind of why now, and why Galaxy, why RxBiologics? What was the fit there that you were looking for?
So the Galaxy platform is very much along the premise of what RxCelerate thinks about drug discovery and development. It's always about building up from first principles. What is the best thing to do? And having thought about an antibody platform, they have been around for many years, and there's been no innovation. So there's been a lot learned, but since Emira and so forth, there's been very little change in that approach to doing it. And having worked with a real flair antibody engineer, Johnny Finley, with some of the work that we were doing at RxCelerate, I posed the question to him: how could we do something that would be the best? How can we make the best platform? Because again, this is what we're wanting to achieve. And he because of his experience, and he'd worked at Pfizer and in biotech, and he'd also been in the US. He could pull on all of the sort of positives and the failings that had happened, and the pain that many antibody engineers had had. And so we came up that, we would do something a little bit different. So we built a platform from first principles, trying to mimic the immune system, rather than just going with lots of diversity and with the view that you pull out an antibody, but then you've got to effectively engineer that antibody to become a drug. We wanted it to be that we get, which is what our strapline is for Galaxy, right first time. So we wanted whichever antibody that we generated from our platform, that it had more drug-like therapeutic properties, so that it could again be that track to the clinic quicker and more efficient.
Yep. Because one of the things that you had mentioned is that when people tend to start with a target, or you start with your first target, you tend to have, you tend to get a molecule that hits that target, and that's your lead, and you're off running, right? And that kind of, there's some steps that are left out there, and it's fine if your lead kind of can go and you can get it through IND enabling studies and get it into the clinic. But you've now placed a lot of faith in this lead molecule, and you kind of want it to be the best lead molecule that it can be. So it does make a lot of sense to have all of these questions, or as many questions as possible, answered up front. With a little bit of my own experience, talking with potential partners about your antibody platform is a little challenging. There's a lot of people who will tell you that the way that they do it is the best, or is just fine.
Of course. It's been interesting because obviously we launched this in mid-February, and the interest we've had is been quite astonishing. So I think the sector needed, or certainly it's made people think. Again, I think there's a lot that will follow the same approach without actually stopping, thinking, is this the right approach to do to make it? And that's it for lots of things, whether it be the gold standard for an animal model, or the way that you pull out a small molecule, and that people don't go through that process of thinking, from first principles on that front. So with regard to our library, we wanted to have obviously diversity, but human B cells are not trying to make drugs. They are doing things in a very regimented fashion, and we've tried to mimic that, but yet control that diversity. And as a result of that, it's led where we can actually get instant bispecifics, by doing a smarter approach to pulling out antibodies and antibody discovery. So yeah, I anticipate and watch this space that hopefully we will get lots of antibodies that will get to the clinic very quickly.
I hope so. I still remember, I forget exactly what year it was. It was probably somewhere around 2013 or 2014. And at the JP Morgan conference, Adimab had basically rented advertising space on the sides of all of the trolleys that were going up and down. They were going up and down the street with the tagline that the three best-selling drugs in the world are all monoclonal antibodies, and we're making numbers 7 through 10 or something along those lines. So it may be, maybe this is time for the next wave of antibody platforms. And quite honestly, that was great advertising. And if there's people there in person in January, you may be able to steal a great idea. So we have a question from the audience, from David Lockman over at Bio. And he said, in the US, there's an effort to weaken intellectual property rights for drugs developed from university research. And he said the argument is that a government investment in the basic research should give the government rights to the final product. So do those kind of proposals affect the work that you do, or do you see that really affecting kind of the discovery type industry within biotech?
Yeah, I don't think that it would impact that much. I mean, with a lot of the, certainly we've not seen yet today. I mean, I think the US is much maturer and further ahead. I think we're still some way behind in some of the sort of questions in terms of that translational piece from academia to the biotech. And so as a result, I think it's actually been sort of molded in a slightly different way to how the US has progressed and developed over time. I mean, it's been, the US, as you all know, has been established so much longer and so much larger and bigger that some of those factors that you find in the US are not always translated to, you know, to where we are in the UK, for example.
So following on that a little bit, what is the environment like in the UK now for, say, either an entrepreneur out of academia or anything like that? And how have the government incentives really helped foster that? I know in New York, you know, we've seen really probably a wave that started, you know, 10, 12 years ago, but has really kind of gained a lot of steam in the last 5 years, and that has certainly been helped by some of the government programs. And now, how would you kind of characterize both the UK and maybe more broadly in Europe in terms of, you know, the market for earlier stage companies? What does a typical company look like when they come to you?
Often, we'll start with the what does a typical company look like? I think it's relatively small, so it's 2-3 people, you know, with an idea that have got some early data, and they don't have a plan, and they don't have very much money. I think is the 2 key things.
One slightly larger than the other. Yes. Slightly larger plan, money.
But they have enthusiasm, and they want to make a difference. And in the UK, and certainly around Cambridge, for example, there is an ecosystem that's developed out. So we have these accelerator programs. So often, some of the people who will come to us are winners or people that have, you know, gone to these accelerator programs, and that's things like Start Code On. There's one here where we are based at the Babram Research Campus, which is Accelerate at Babram. There's Illumina. There's, you know, ones at the Crick Institute. You know, they're all over things, of which each year now they will take a certain number. Some of them they will give them labs for a short time, and they will give them mentorships and a small amount of money. And it's usually at those stages that they are, you know, we are mentoring and helping that ecosystem, because they need to have a plan, they need to know what those killer experiments are, and they need to get funding. So we can be doing on those things. There are obviously ones that are a bit more established that, you know, I've got that where they've got money already, but they still are not quite sure on where that plan would go, particularly if you're a platform company. So if they've got a technology and there are lots of hits that they could, you know, move forward, one of the things is, how do you choose which one you take forward as your proof of concept? That's a really important point of selecting out, because it's going to effectively lead for what is your, you know, research platform and generate that engine, you know, of ideas. And so it may not be the first one that you've identified in the platform. It may be that it's subsequent ones that, you know, are either the proof of concept is simpler or it's quicker and cheaper to do, that then would be proof of concept to be able to get, you know, to those wider ones. So we can be inputting in all of those kind of things. But ultimately, what anybody with a good idea, and even large pharma, you know, we worked with, you know, and work with, you know, quite a number of the large pharma, which wasn't something that I thought we would do when we set out with the vision of RxCelerate. But nevertheless, it's been something where people have obviously thought within their programs that we could add value. And I've certainly heard, from senior directors in pharma, they've worked 20 years in something, but they've never thought to do it like what we've done it. Sometimes having a fresh pair of eyes or looking at things from a very different perspective and not necessarily following that norm can, give insight which has not been previously revealed.
So this is a slightly difficult question, right? So you're a venture funded company, but you don't take any equity with any of your clients or in any of their projects, right? So how do you maintain the culture of kind of that level of insight and involvement as you want to grow, right? How do you stop yourself from becoming the kind of CRO that really was kind of the antithesis of why you started the company?
So just to clarify and just to make sure that, we are not funded directly per se by any VCs.
Okay.
So all the companies themselves have that funding and it's on a fee for contract. So we're not influenced by any one sector on that. So
okay.
We can keep that individuality. In terms of how we move forward and choose that thing, it's really important that we are considering each in its own merit on that front, and very much so that here in Cambridge we've got access to the key opinion leaders and so forth that can add in to us looking at that funding piece and that planning piece, which can be really important for what we're advising people and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, so we have you want to go with the next question or
Yeah.
fire away?
Yeah, so we have another question from the audience, which is we can't help ourselves but ask about the EU, UK, USA comparisons. So basically the question is, it has a question about how do you find biotech development in the UK and EU from a mindset perspective, as well as the pace of development and resources available. The USA is known for its aggressiveness, risk-taking, and throwing large amounts of cash at challenging problems, whereas Europe tends to be more conservative. We know that even at the pharma level, these organizations are dramatically different. Does this mindset still hold true at the early stage biotech side of things? And is this an advantage or disadvantage?
That's an excellent question and a very good synopsis of the difference. I mean, one of the key differences, I suppose, from the certainly UK to US that is most apparent is pace.
Pace?
Pace, I think. Yeah, and that's something that we are trying to generate is pace. I mean, our name RxCelerate is not for any, it's to try and have that focus of those key decisions, having that ability to, if programs, to have that attrition if it's not going to move forward. So that is a key difference. And of course, if you've got, somebody with a good idea in those early stages, it can be that they want to be a biotech and they want to progress. And so as a result, they can have a small pot of money or a larger pot of money, and they're very cautious to spend anything because they want to make the right decision to move forward with that pot of money, and they don't want to stop. The idea that their good idea or what they've been working on for 15, 20 years is not a good idea or doesn't have that translational piece. It is not a good thing. So they want to carry on. And it's a real mindset in those very, very early stages about trying every avenue and every possible. But of course, now that doesn't sit with VCs. It's, VCs are wanting to do those things, work, not work, move on, next project. So the two don't sit together. And I suppose we are trying to interface and educate that, you've got a good idea, yes, it works, or no, it doesn't, then, think of another idea, or is there something else that we can translate from that? So, but certainly, a big difference from US to UK, what so far is that pace piece. The US contract, yes, they've got larger amounts of investment, but they are, they are getting to IND quicker than what they are in the UK for the most part.
You've hit on a really big, I guess, component of the industry and of funding, which is, a binary decision process, right? Things either work or don't work. They are abandoned or they are moved forward. And, it's a very challenging process because you very often don't get more than one shot, even with science that could affect multiple different areas, right? You have to be really careful about the way that you communicate what you're doing so that you can say, listen, we're going to try it here first. And then if it goes to here, there's a cascade of other things that you can do. And there's a bit of a balance between selling, I suppose is the wrong word, but describing the benefits of a particular molecule or particular technology in one area, yet still kind of maintaining the fact that it can go into different places. So when you see something like that has these broad scale possibilities, do you kind of hone in on what do we think we should do first? Or do you think about laying out, what does the universe look like and what do we have the opportunities to do here?
A bit of both. It depends on the plans, but for the most part, it's what do we do first? I mean, invariably, the more money you have, the wider those discussions, and what those programs are. If you've only got a limited budget, you're thinking about what those key bits are, and and it makes you make those decisions, really selectively. So it's about the need to have, not the nice to have. And as a result of that really does focus those key scientific questions and that translational piece to the clinic. Yeah. So I would say that that's probably the main focus of where we go when we're advising. But it's about going through a process to get to that point. You are effectively evaluating that wider piece and that narrower piece and deciding which is best. Those bespoke programs, everyone, whether it's, every idea needs to be bespoke and very much tailored for the need, for whether it's a small molecule, if it's a cell-based or an antibody, and the therapeutic indication. It's not one size fits all. And again, that's something again where I think having experience with drug developers that's done that translational piece, it allows you to come and pool on all of that wealth of experience rather than just be a service provider. Yeah.
It also helps when someone tells you that, oh, I've seen this before. Right, because the industry recycles ideas and everything that's old is new again. But you bring up a program to somebody that worked on a similar one 10 years ago, whether it's the same target or similar mechanism, and that failed. They will very quickly tell you that this is not going to work, and I've seen this before, and this is not something we want to spend time on. So there's always a challenge of saying, no, this time it's different, and here's why, and here's what our approach is.
Well, there's also a little bit of, if I couldn't do it, then you probably can't do it either. Right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, no, very much so. And I suppose, we obviously as scientists, that biotech has become more and more emerging and so forth. So as a scientist, there's very few now that just want to be academics. They want to do that translational piece. It's part of the sort of career pathway. And so there's a lot of pressure to be able to achieve something there, even if it's as being part of that, certainly in the ecosystems that are evolving. Yeah.
Do you actually see things coming out of academia a little bit more advanced than they used to be? Because even just from New York's standpoint, all of the universities in New York have these programs that will, advance their internal candidates and do a decent amount of CRO work. We have the TRI-TDI between Rockefeller, Sloan Kettering, and Cornell. We have all of these things that, basically help their internal compounds get to the point where they've got a little more data behind them. So are you seeing things come out of academia that are kind of a cut above where they used to be with a little better data packages behind them?
That is starting to emerge. I mean, here in Cambridge, you've got these bridge funds and translational funds that will allow that piece to increase the asset value. or to make them more attractive for VCs, or to, large pharma are investing, are doing collaborative work with research groups and effectively developing the ideas within academics, and whether that's, through granting, through grants, but also that translational piece. We have a lot of scientists where they might work and interface with academia and with pharma and do parts and so forth. So yeah, I can see that happening more and more. Where there's those bridge funds or investment funds that they, want to help with that smaller piece to be able to get those, more established ideas.
Is it still mostly organic now, or are you starting to see these large formal collaborations occur in the UK?
So formal there are more and more formal collaborations. I mean, the ecosystem has really developed and accelerated over the last 5 years or so, and it's becoming more and more apparent that all of these different strands just add to that ecosystem of generating, where ideas and there's investment. I mean, one of the things that David would always claim and still claims today, if you've got a good idea and it's something, you will get funding for it some way. And I think for the most part, that's probably holds true in the UK now.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. And, I really liked the vision that you laid out for the company, which is helping anyone with a good idea advance their science, just because, you think about good ideas that could come from anywhere, and science is pretty universal, and that good science is good science is good science regardless of where it's performed. So if you're going to think about the future, what do you think RxCelerate looks like in 5 years?
Gosh,
or 3 years. You can change the time scale at your whim.
I meant the overall vision I mentioned was to be able to take something, a good idea, and take it all the way to proof of concept in the clinic, and all those important pieces along that drug discovery, agnostic to the kind of therapy and agnostic to the therapeutic indication, is what we are trying to achieve, to become a one-stop shop. But we will still use other service providers if we feel that they are within our programs, that we couldn't replicate it because, they can do it quicker, cheaper, faster, and so forth. So with that in mind, we've still got some pieces still to add. We've still got some further bits on the clinical area, and a little bit more on the DMPK. We're already developing the AI technology with our systems biology and our in silico, but that needs a wider piece there. And then beyond that, it's once we've got those kind of things, we could think about, well, can we generate our own therapeutics and become and that may be something that we will consider. But my main thread has been for is to establish that vision of a one-stop shop first, and being able to do that. I mean, a lot of our clients have repeat business. They like the way that we're interacting. I mean, we are sharing data in real time. Data can come off one day, the same day or the next day. We are sharing and making those decisions. We're doing weekly meetings. It's incredibly pace-driven. That's just as if you are in the lab with these smaller companies and ideas. And we really want to have that translational piece taken forward.
We had a question from the audience, and I'm going to ask it and add to it. So the question is, do you see an entrepreneurial brain drain to the US as a result of those, the discussion we had earlier about the US tends to accelerate things faster, you fail and then move on, versus the UK. And then RxCelerate has a location, right? You also have a presence in the US. So talk to us about how that also plays into your decision to actually start to do business in the US and have a location here as well.
So brain drain it's an interesting concept. I think it potentially can happen. While ever there's investment in the UK, I think that that will in itself lead those ideas and that translational piece. But if they find that those loops, those collaborations, and things don't start to emerge, then I can see that, they will be looking at those wider pieces in terms of, the VCs and so forth. The expectation in the UK is getting higher. They see, the VCs in the UK see the difference between the US. And so they are starting to, they will start to put pressure on for that delivery. And you can, I can see over the next few years that they will be, killing more projects than they are actually taking forward for that reason, because they won't be going at their expected. Being a VC is a business decision. It's not driven by the science in per se of these scientists with a good idea that want to move things forward on that front. And what was the other part of your thing? Oh, RxCelerate in the US. So obviously it was important to establish Cambridge and all of those kind of things. But, I knew that for us to, when I started RxCelerate, there was two key things. It was a key thing was, we couldn't compete against those really large service providers that are out there. So we had to do something a little bit different. And as a result, I was very keen that we establish ourselves in the UK first, but then, look for those clusters so that we are, in San Francisco and Boston, that we are, looking to have that translational piece where it's that, we have a small team where they can be thinking about the plans and the delivery, but the work is always going to be executed, certainly at the moment in Cambridge, UK, that wet lab work. But, watch this space. That could be something that, we feel that we may be able to add, into the US. But it was always about where, where those clusters are and what the impact that we could do. And of course, it could be something in the future. Yeah.
It's just so that we don't, Derek and I don't ruin our streak of talking about COVID on every breakfast.
Wouldn't want to ruin that.
Soon we'll move on. So obviously we only have a few minutes left. How have you all handled, sort of your restrictions, your government restrictions, and staying in the lab? And what do you see the progression for you all at RxCelerate on dealing with that?
So we've probably done it pretty much the same as everybody else. So obviously working in a lab, you need to work in a lab. So we focused on making sure that, we're COVID safe for everybody that works in a lab. The ones that are more desk-based that could work effectively at home, they have transitioned into either a blended approach or, purely working at home on that virtual platform. And it's worked very well. So throughout the whole of, where we are today, we have continued to deliver programs, whether it's been animal studies or, our biology or small molecule work, any of those kind of things, just as effectively as pre-COVID on that front. And I think that's an approach that, a lot of companies have had. Yeah.
All right. Well, we are just about to hit 10 o'clock. Thank you so much for coming today. This was fantastic. We love to have people on that have innovative approaches to discovery and entrepreneurship, and you've been an amazing guest. So thank you. A special thank you to Matt Burkhart to help kind of set up the introduction and everything. Matt's terrific, and I've known him for ages. So Jill, thank you very much for joining us today. Everybody, I hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks for spending time with us this morning.
Thanks.
Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Jill.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.